Until the lions have their own historians, the tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Africa is facing 1,400 years of Arab-Muslim imperialism. After the West, the Arab world, is the second force that seeks to rule the black world. As long as the Arabs living in North Africa feel more attached to their racial brethren in the Middle East than to the rest of black Africa, we will have the duty and the right to defend ourselves against their racist attitude. These were the words of the master teacher, Cheikh Anta Diop, in his book, Alerte sous les tropiques. We will begin by laying down the bare truth regarding these so-called North African countries. Take a look at this map. The Arab League is an international organization that unites countries identifying themselves as Arab. It was founded by Gamal Abdel Nasser, the former president of Egypt, and a prominent advocate of Pan-Arabism. The headquarters of the Arab League are located in Egypt, a country with a rich history that holds significant relevance to many black African nations. The Arab League's influence extends beyond North Africa, reaching into other parts of the continent. In West Africa, Mauritania is a member, while in East Africa, Somalia and Djibouti are part of the League. Despite their predominantly black populations, Somalia and Djibouti are associated with Arab identity, largely due to the influence of Islam. The Arab League's presence is also felt near Central Africa, with Sudan being a member. This widespread membership underscores the cultural and political influence of the Arab world. Interestingly, about 3/4 of the land area of these Arab League states is actually located in Africa. This expansion of Arab influence into the African continent has significant implications. It has led to a gradual pushing of black African communities further south, reducing their living space and freedoms. In this video, we will expose how the growth of the Arab world in Africa is impacting the lives and liberties of black African populations, making it a matter of vital importance and concern. In April 1989, a tense situation unfolded between Senegal and Mauritania, leading to significant upheaval. The government of Mauritania, predominantly Arab Berber, used a border dispute as an opportunity to carry out widespread discrimination against its black citizens. Black Mauritanians, including government workers, military members, and private company employees, were unjustly arrested, and their identification documents were taken away. They were forcibly sent to neighboring countries, Senegal and Mali. The situation escalated as these actions spread to various towns, targeting ethnic groups like the Fulani, Wolof, and Soninka. Many Fulani living near the Senegal River in Mauritania were expelled by armed Arab Berbers. Their lands and homes were seized, and even their village names were changed to Arabic names. This tragic period, often referred to as ethnic cleansing, resulted in an estimated 120,000 to 200,000 black Mauritanians losing their homes, properties, and national identities, leading to
the wall with the skit going on. Sudan, the largest country in Africa, lies where the Sahara Desert meets the grasslands of the Sahel. Since its independence in 1956, civil wars between Sudan's north and south have killed millions and displaced millions more. Now a new conflict has emerged in its westernmost region, called Darfur. Nearly the size of France, this vast region has been neglected for years by the government. Darfur means Land of the Four, a Muslim African tribe indigenous to the area. The region is inhabited by many tribes that are racially and culturally intertwined. But despite these cultural similarities, groups of farmers who are viewed as African and groups of herders who are considered Arab have had clashes over the land for decades. Droughts, famines, desertification, and population pressures have added to the rising tensions. Since 2003, rebel groups have fought against the government, accusing it of supporting the Arab herders over the African farmers. The government's response caused a mass exodus, forcing villagers to become refugees in their own homeland. In this United Nations refugee camp along the Chad-Sudan border, the women and children here seek asylum from the Janjaweed, the armed militias of Arab herders organized by the government to fight the rebels and kill civilians. Entire villages have been burned, hundreds of thousands have died. Beatings, rapes, and mutilations are used as weapons of terror. Around 2 million people, almost a third of Darfur's population, have fled their villages. These refugees have lost everything, but they are the lucky ones. Most still wander the land, unable to go home, their lives still at risk. Despite international pressure, the fighting still continues. And in Darfur, the people are still dying.
Many Africans view this issue through the lens of a long history of enslavement, since the Arabs' arrival on the continent. However, this situation also reflects a larger, more complex, geopolitical dynamic of Arab-Muslim influence, which involves issues of territorial control, cultural identity, and human rights. Northwest Africa, including regions like Libya and Egypt, was originally inhabited by black populations. These early inhabitants of the Maghreb and the Sahara played a crucial role in developing Berber languages and culture. The Romans, who arrived in Africa later, referred to these people as Moors, a term they used to denote blacks. They named the region Mauritania, translating to Land of the Blacks, a term that influenced the modern name Mauritania. In the 6th century, Arab forces entered the continent, establishing their control over North Africa, including Egypt. They spread Islam throughout the region. Despite being in the minority, the Arabs allowed the Islamized Moors to govern the Maghreb. Later, from the 16th century, the Ottoman Turks expanded their empire from Egypt to the edges of Morocco. Starting from the 8th century, these Muslim rulers, particularly the Turks in later periods, engaged in the enslavement of both black populations south of the Sahara and some Moors, as well as millions of white European Christians, many of whom were Islamized. Over time, this led to a significant change in the demographic composition of the Maghreb. The region became predominantly mixed and white, with blacks becoming a minority. This shift was so pronounced that in Mauritania, a distinction was made between black Berbers and white Berbers, reflecting the diverse racial and cultural history of the region. The original meaning of the word Moor has faded over time. Historically, it referred to the indigenous black inhabitants of Northwest Africa. However, in modern times, some Arab Berber groups, who are predominantly white, have redefined the term to refer exclusively to themselves. They even claim that Mauritania, which historically meant Land of the Blacks, now signifies Land of the Berber Whites. This reinterpretation of language is a tactic used by these groups to assert their influence and dominance in Mauritania, a West African country. This situation highlights an ongoing, yet often overlooked, struggle between African and Arab Muslim influences in the region. In Mauritania, a minority group known as Beidanes, who are white and make up about 25% of the population, hold significant power, wealth, and privileges. The Arab Berbers in Mauritania have established a system where black Moors, known as Haratines, and nearly half the population, face severe discrimination and are often subjected to slavery. The remaining 25% of the population, comprised of black ethnic groups, like the Fulani, Wolof, and Soninka, also face discrimination and were targets of the 1989 ethnic cleansing aimed at reducing the black majority. Islam plays a crucial role in maintaining this power structure. The Arab Berber whites, partly of Arab origin, see themselves as divinely superior due to their Islamic faith. They believe they are inherently superior to black people, whom they consider to be of pagan origin and naturally destined for slavery. This belief is rooted in their interpretation of Islamic texts, with the expectation that Islamized blacks will accept this hierarchy as a divine will. Since Mauritania's independence, there has been an effort to align the country more closely with Arab Islamic identity, predominantly to benefit the Arab Berber whites. A similar situation is seen in neighboring Mali, where light-skinned Tuaregs in the north, who have also been involved in the Arab slave trade, face distrust from the black Malinka population and feel excluded from governance. These Tuaregs, who historically were black but have become lighter-skinned over time, often view darker-skinned Tuaregs and others as inferiors or slaves. This attitude led to fears among black Tuaregs of potential enslavement in an independent Tuareg state. Both in Mauritania and northern Mali, these dynamics are part of a broader pattern of racial hierarchy. This perception of blacks as natural slaves is deeply ingrained in some Arab and white Berber societies, to the extent that the term abid, slave, is commonly used to refer to black people. This mindset was reinforced during European colonization, particularly by the French and British, who promoted ideas of white supremacy and black inferiority in North Africa. This narrative overshadowed the history of white slavery in the region. As a result, many whites and mixed-race people in the region, some of whom are descendants of slaves, have adopted these racist attitudes. While they consider themselves inferior to European whites, they regard themselves as superior to blacks, often expressing this through overt violence and discrimination. This complex historical and social context has led to persistent racial tensions and inequalities. The so-called white peoples of North Africa do not consider themselves to be Africans and do not consider their countries to be part of Africa. Africa, for them, refers to the south of the Sahara and is something repulsive. In Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, black populations face significant challenges. They often experience harassment, including insults and being spat on. In the media, they are typically portrayed in subservient roles, such as servants. In some cases, such as in Tunisia, they are even buried in segregated cemeteries. Furthermore, their historical contributions to the region are largely unrecognized or denied. The issue extends beyond religious differences to include an obsession with whiteness and the perceived superiority of lighter skin. Historically, in the 14th century, Arab invaders conquered northeastern Sudan, overthrowing its black Christian kingdoms. While the southern part of Sudan remained predominantly black, animist, and Christian, the western part was already Muslim. During British colonial rule, these distinct regions were unified into one country. Post-colonization, the Arab-majority government in Sudan sought to impose the Arabic language, Islam, and Sharia law throughout the country, aiming to control the oil-rich south. This drive for dominance led to prolonged civil wars between the northern and southern regions of Sudan, resulting in the death of 3 million people, widespread humanitarian crises in the south, and the enslavement of thousands of people considered idolatrous. It wasn't until 2011 that South Sudan gained independence, a significant event that symbolized the reclaiming of land and autonomy by African peoples. This history highlights the complex and often tumultuous relationship between different cultural and racial groups in these North African countries. In Sudan, black populations have faced significant challenges due to their exclusion from power and control over their resources by Arab groups. This tension escalated, particularly in the western region of Darfur. Beginning in 2003, the Arab-dominated government's response to protests and unrest in Darfur led to a tragic conflict, resulting in the deaths of approximately 300,000 people. This conflict, often labeled as genocide, was fueled by claims of ethnic and religious superiority by the Arab groups. The conflict in Darfur was justified by the Arab groups through a narrative of ethnic supremacy. In the south, the justification was rooted in religious supremacy. Fundamentalist interpretations of Islam, as understood by some groups, position it as the only valid religion, not recognizing the validity of other beliefs. This perspective led to the notion that non-Muslims, particularly those practicing traditional African spiritualities, should be converted or eliminated. This belief system views Africa, with its diverse spiritual traditions, as a land needing to be redeemed by Islam. In this context, Sudanese Arabs often claim to be the true representatives of Sudan. However, this claim overlooks the fact that the name Sudan itself is derived from the Arabic word for black, historically referring to the region's black inhabitants. This situation highlights the complex interplay of ethnicity, religion, and identity in the region, where historical and cultural narratives are often contested and used to justify political and social agendas. The history of Sudan and its connection to the ancient pharaonic era is a topic of debate. Some argue that closely linking Sudan to this history could validate the historical presence and contributions of Black Africans in the region. This issue relates to broader concerns about historical accuracy. A significant event highlighting this debate was a UNESCO symposium in Cairo in 1974, where Arab Egyptologists and Western scholars, including Cheikh Anta Diop and Theophilo Benga, discussed the ethnic origins of the ancient Egyptians. The controversy revolves around a common belief in North Africa that Black Africans are exclusively from sub-Saharan Africa and have historically been marginalized. Asserting that Black Africans were the original inhabitants and key contributors to North African civilization suggests they have long-standing ties to the region. This perspective challenges some established historical narratives, which some believe are altered to diminish the role of Black Africans. For instance, modern Tunisians rarely acknowledge the Carthaginians as Black Africans, and it's uncommon for Moroccans to recognize the Black African heritage of their imperial dynasties. Admitting such historical facts could potentially disrupt existing social structures and perspectives on land ownership in these regions. This situation exemplifies how altering historical narratives can influence current perceptions and social dynamics, particularly in the context of Africa's diverse cultural and ethnic heritage. The question of why Black African nations often do not intervene in conflicts involving Arab-dominated countries in North Africa raises important issues. For example, there was little objection when Mohammed Ould Abdelaziz, an Arab Berber president from Mauritania, became the head of the African Union in 2014, despite concerns about the treatment of Black populations in Mauritania. The proposed solutions for addressing the complex relationship between Black African nations and Arab Muslim countries in North Africa involve several key steps. Recognizing distinct futures. It's suggested that there should be an acknowledgement of the separate paths of the Black and Arab Muslim worlds. This perspective argues that the African Union, in its current form, should be re-evaluated and possibly replaced with a union exclusively for Black states. The idea is that a union of only Black African states would be more effective, particularly in military terms, in addressing conflicts and challenges specific to these nations. Cultural and religious considerations. The proposal includes controlling the spread of Islam in Black African countries. The recommendation is to promote African vitalism, a concept championed by Cheikh Anta Diop, which emphasizes the celebration and glorification of Black identity and culture. The aim is to strengthen cultural identity and reduce the influence of foreign languages like Arabic, especially in countries like Chad, where Arabic is an official language. Historical accuracy, emphasizing the importance of historical truth about the primary presence and civilizing role of Black Africans throughout the continent, especially in North Africa, is seen as crucial. This approach focuses on asserting the historical claim of Black Africans to the entire continent, challenging narratives that minimize their contributions and presence, particularly in North Africa. Action against slavery. Specific measures are called for to address and end the practice of slavery in countries like Mauritania. This action is seen as a critical step in ensuring human rights and dignity for all Africans. These solutions highlight the need for a more unified and self-determined approach among Black African nations in addressing their unique historical, cultural, and geopolitical challenges.
The 25th of March was, as usual, commemorated as the day Britain officially abolished its slave trade in 1807. But how many recall that Arab slavers were the first and last in modern times to ship millions of Africans out of the continent as slaves? The Arab history of anti-Black racism predates European anti-Black racism by several centuries. The early Islamic Empire exhibited all the characteristics of anti-Black racism, and Blacks suffered the lowest form of bondage. Europeans took photographs of chained Black African slaves in Arab slave trading vessels on the east coast of Africa in the 1880s. Slavery persisted openly in Saudi Arabia and other Muslim countries in the latter half of the 20th century, 100 years after slavery was abolished in the United States. As late as the 1960s, African Muslims still sold slaves when they arrived on pilgrimages, as a way to finance their pilgrimages. Arab nations lagged far behind the rest of the world in abolishing slavery. Saudi Arabia and Yemen in 1962, United Arab Emirates in 1963, Oman in 1970. However, unlike the rest of the Arab nations, hereditary racial slavery persists in Mauritania, despite multiple official attempts to abolish it. In 1981, by presidential decree, Mauritania became the last country in the world to abolish slavery, but no criminal laws were passed to enforce the ban. Under international pressure in 2007, the Mauritanian government passed a law allowing slaveholders to be persecuted. However, that law has rarely been enforced. Far more anti-slavery human rights activists have been prosecuted than the handful of Mauritanian white masters. In addition, slavers are offered compensation for freeing the enslaved, while the victims of the brutality are offered nothing. In 2015, under international and some domestic mobilization pressure, the Mauritanian government created 3 special courts to prosecute slavery, but so far they have only tried very few cases. However, that's just not all about this oddly unique sect of slavers. The Arab slavers, at some point in history driven outrageously by their odd ambition for economic power and human control, had their African male captives subjected to unimaginable suffering and exploitation. Castration. Yes, you heard correctly. Now, it is of utmost importance to note that what you are about to hear might seem like comparing which, between 2 evils, is better. It does not detract from the fact that the trade in human beings was unspeakably hideous. In the Americas, slaves were allowed to marry, though their children could be sold off like puppies right before their eyes. But what happened to the blacks enslaved by the Arabs? Arabs castrated African slaves. Thus, they could not reproduce their kinds to multiply and replenish the earth. Welcome to yet another video segment. In this video, we are taking a dive at one of the darkest chapters in the human history, marked by its profound brutality and stomach-twisting inhumanity, the Arab slave trade and the castration of their male captives during this dark era. Before we get right into this head-spinning narrative, don't forget to like this video as a way of acknowledging our efforts, share with family and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening black narrative, and subscribe to keep the channel growing. Your support means a lot to us. The castration of male captives during the Arab slave trade would be a forever-lasting, devastating experience for the individuals who were subjected to this depraved, inhuman practice and their families. In his book, Slaves and Slavery, published in 1998, the British writer Duncan Clark defines slavery as the reduction of fellow human beings to the legal status of chattels, allowing them to be bought and sold as goods. This, in essence, is what both the Arabs and Europeans did to Africans, to justify the shipping of millions of Africans as slaves to faraway lands in Asia, in particular the Middle East and the Americas. The African slave trade, surely one of the most tragic and disturbing episodes in the history of mankind, Clark uncovers in his book, had its origins in the intervention of forces from the civilizations that developed in the regions of the Mediterranean Sea, today's Europe and the Middle East, into the arena of the more fragmented civilizations of sub-Saharan Africa. Africa became a source of slaves for the cultures of the Mediterranean world many centuries before the discovery of the Americas, but it was that discovery and the resulting shift in focus towards the Atlantic that prompted the culminating explosive growth in slavery with such tragic effect. Slavery was, in fact, a central feature of life in the Mediterranean world, especially in Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, Greece, Imperial Rome, and the Islamic societies of the Middle East and North Africa. The most important source of slaves in medieval Europe, Clark's research shows, was the coast of Bosnia on the eastern shores of the Adriatic Sea. The word slave and its cognates in most modern European languages is itself derived from Sclavis's meaning Slav, the ethnic name for the inhabitants of this region. For various reasons, including the harshness of the terrain and endemic warfare among local clans, Bosnia proved the most convenient and long-lasting of these slave-supplying regions. Whichever clan gained a temporary upper hand was always willing to sell its captured rivals in exchange for the goods of the Mediterranean world in the markets of the ancient Romanized city of Ragusa, that is, present-day Dubrovnik. From there, Slavs were shipped as slaves by Venetian merchants to supply new markets in the Islamic world. Thus, for the Islamic world, Clark further reveals, Slavs provided the major source of slaves in the 250 or so years between the defeat at the Battle of Poitiers in AD 732 that forced the consolidation of their dramatic conquests across North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula, cutting back the flow of war captives, and the expansion of the import of black Africans across the Sahara from around AD 1000. The number of people enslaved by Muslims has been a hotly debated topic, especially when the millions of Africans forced from their homelands are considered. With full control of a great part of Africa, the Arabs began to capture young boys and girls and took them to Egypt, where they were sold into slavery within Africa, or taken across the Indian Ocean to Indonesia, China, Southwest Asia, and India. By the 10th century, the demand for slaves from Africa to work as plantation hands, sex slaves, domestic maids, and slave warriors had increased greatly, so much so that an estimated number of 5,000 slaves were shipped out of Africa a year. The historian Paul Lovejoy estimates that some 9.85 million Africans were shipped out as slaves to Arabia, and in small numbers to the Indian subcontinent. Lovejoy breaks his figures down as follows. Between AD 650 and 1600, an average of 5,000 Africans were shipped out per annum by the Arabs. This makes a rough total of 7.25 million. Then, between 1600 and 1800, another 1.4 million Africans were shipped out by the Arabs. The 19th century represented the highest point of the Arabian trade, as 12,000 Africans were vehemently shipped out per annum. The total figure for the 19th century alone was 1.2 million slaves to Arabia. Some other historians estimate altogether that between AD 650 and 1900, 10 million to 20 million people were enslaved by Arab slave traders. Others believe that over 20 million enslaved Africans alone had been delivered through the trans-Saharan route alone to the Islamic world. Dr. John Alambella Azuma estimates in his 2001 book, The Legacy of Arab Islam in Africa, that over 80 million more black people died over that route. The Arab slave trade was so intense, bloody, merciless to say the least. The cruelty on African captives by the Arabs was beyond telling. Similar to the transatlantic slave trade, captured slaves were beaten to be weakened and chained together. However, captured victims in the sub-Saharan slave trade had to endure several weeks of walking through the desert, carrying loads for their new masters from West or East Africa, to where they were eventually sold in the slave markets: Cairo, Baghdad, Istanbul, Mecca, and other centers. These slaves played various roles in the economy of the Muslim world. They were used as servants, harem keepers, laborers in fields, mines, and hydraulic yards, and as cannon fodder in armies. In several of his detailed books about the slave trade, British explorer Henry Hamilton Johnston explains how several slaves died in the desert, while others who fell sick or were badly bruised and could not make it were brutally killed by their masters. David Livingstone, the British missionary, traveler, and explorer, was so upset by the way the Arabs treated their African slaves that he wrote back home in the year 1870. These were his words: "In less than I take to talk about it, these unfortunate creatures, 84 of them, wended their way into the village where we were. Some of them, the eldest, were women from 20 to 22 years of age, and there were youths from 18 to 19 years. But the large majority was made up of boys and girls from 7 years to 14 or 15 years of age. A more terrible scene than these men, women, and children I do not think I ever came across. To say that they were emaciated would not give you an idea of what human beings can undergo under certain circumstances. Each of them had his neck in a large forked stick weighing from 30 to 40 pounds and 5 or 6 feet long, cut with a fork at the end of it where the branches of a tree spread out. The women were tethered with bark thongs, which are of all things the most cruel to be tied with. Of course, the bark thongs are soft and supple when first stripped off the trees, but a few hours in the sun would make them about as hard as the iron-round packing cases. The little children were fastened by thongs to their mothers. As we passed along the path through which these slaves had traveled, I was shown a spot in the bushes where a poor woman the day before, unable to keep up with the march and most likely to hinder it, was cut down by the axe of one of these slave drivers. We went on further and were shown a place where a child lay. It had been recently born, and its mother was unable to carry it from debility and exhaustion. So the slave trader had taken this little infant by its feet and dashed its brains out against one of the trees and thrown it in there. Such was the brutality meted out to the Africans by the Arabs. Looking at all this in a very factly honest manner, the totality of the unthinkable, horrid practices besetted upon a certain group of people. Historians agree that it is a mistake to equate the bare survival of Africa with cultural or social or economic stagnation, for the slave trade visited such panoply of tragically interconnected disasters into the lives of every African for centuries, so that they have worked their way into the very racial memory of the continent and its people, particularly females, that only with time and kindness can it be expunged from the psyche of Africa. The Arabs' treatment of black Africans can aptly be termed an African genocide. Arabs killed more Africans in transit, especially when crossing the Sahara Desert, than Europeans and Americans combined, and over more centuries, both before and after the years of the Atlantic slave trade. Arab Muslims began extracting millions of black African slaves centuries before Christian nations did. Arab slave traders removed slaves from Africa for about 13 centuries, compared to the 3 centuries of the Atlantic slave trade. African slaves transported by Arabs across the Sahara Desert died more often than slaves making the Middle Passage to the New World by ship. Slaves invariably died within 5 years if they worked in the Ottoman Empire's Sahara salt mines. Black Africans did not enjoy immunity to many of the diseases found in the Arab world, which also resulted in high death rates. In West Africa, the Arab slave trade encompassed a vast region from the Niger Valley to the Gulf of Guinea. This traffic followed the trans-Saharan roads. The crossing could last up to 3 months with a high mortality rate due to the dire conditions of the trip. Here is the testimony of the German explorer Gustav Nachtigall. The poor children of the black countries seemed to meet death here, at the last stage of a long, hopeless, and painful journey. The long journey accomplished with insufficient food and scarce water, the contrast between the rich natural resources and the humid atmosphere of their homeland, and the dry and anemic air of the desert, the fatigue and the privations imposed by their masters and by the circumstances in which they find themselves, all this has gradually ruined their young strengths. The memory of their homeland that has disappeared along the way, their fear of an unknown future, the endless journey under the blows, hunger, thirst, and deadly exhaustion have paralyzed their last faculties of resistance. If the poor creatures lack strength to get up and walk again, they are simply abandoned, and their minds slowly fade under the destructive effect of the rays of the sun, hunger, and thirst. According to the work of some historians, the Arab slave trade has affected more than 17 million people. In the Saharan region alone, more than 9 million African captives were deported and 2 million died on the roads. This despicable phenomenon was legitimized by Islam, as Christianity would later condone the transatlantic slave trade. For example, the Tunisian Arab historian Ibn Khaldun, from 1332 to 1406, wrote that the only peoples to accept slavery are the Negroes because of their lower degree of humanity, their place being closer to the animal stage. Another one, the Algerian Arab theologian Ahmed al-Wancharisi, from 1430/1431 to 1508, offered legal and religious recommendations. This, he said, "I have been asked about slaves from the land of Abyssinia who profess monotheism and accept the rules of the Holy Law. Is it legal or not to buy and sell them? If their conversion to Islam comes after the establishment of a property right on these slaves, then Islam does not demand liberation, because slavery was caused by unbelief. The state of servitude persists after the disappearance of unbelief because of its existence in the past." The Arab slave trade was characterized by appalling violence, rape, and worst of all, castration of black male slaves. While African women and girls were targeted, captured, and deported by Arab slavers for use as sex slaves, the male captives were, on the other hand, pitilessly castrated to prevent them from reproducing and becoming a stock. Castration of male slaves became a habit among slave traders due to the fact that they were in higher demand, stronger, noted to work faster and more efficiently, and were not a threat to slave masters and owners who feared that their wives, concubines, and female slaves would have affairs with them. The suffering inflicted on the victims of castration was profound, encompassing physical and psychological trauma. Castration was done to boys between the ages of 9 and 12, as it was believed that they survived the process more than an adult or adolescent. Although very many did not survive the process, as they often died during or after the harrowing operation. Whites died more, so slavers concentrated more on blacks. This was the darkest chapter in history that highlights the extent to which humans were dehumanized and exploited for gain. Here's a more detailed insight into this practice. 1. Economic factors. One of the primary reasons for castrating male captives was economic. The exporting countries had good economic incentives to castrate male slaves before they were shipped off. In the medieval slaving industry that was designed for exporting Slavic prisoners of war to the Arab world, castrating the slaves was an integral part of the process. Castration was then performed in the famous castration houses in Venice. Eunuchs, or castrated male slaves, were highly sought after due to their perceived trustworthiness and reliability. Eunuchs were considered valuable commodities in Arab societies, thus fetching much higher prices in slave markets compared to non-castrated slaves. Their lack of reproductive capability meant that they could serve in positions of trust and authority without posing a threat to the owner's hereditary wealth and power. Eunuchs were often employed in sensitive positions such as harem guards, administrative posts, and as servants in elite households. They served in influential positions in the Abbasid Caliphate's administration, with some even rising to the rank of vizier. The economic incentives gained by slave traders from exporting black eunuchs to the Arab nations encouraged the practice of castration. In some cases, such as the Zanj rebellion in the 9th century Iraq, castrated slaves were sought after to work in dangerous and demanding environments like salt mines. This practice had persisted for centuries in the Arab slave trade. As late as 1903, there were still 194 African eunuchs in service to the Ottoman ruling family. 2. Control and domination. Castration was employed by Arab slavers as a means of exerting control and dominance over their male captives. By removing their ability to procreate, the slavers aimed to eliminate any potential threats of rebellion or the establishment of rival lineages. Additionally, castration was intended to ensure that these slaves would remain solely devoted to their master's demands without the distractions of family or personal attachments. 3. Social dislocation. Enslaved males who were castrated were forcibly removed from their communities and families. This social dislocation had far-reaching consequences as it disrupted the social fabric of African societies and led to imbalanced gender ratios. In regions where castration was prevalent, such as East Africa and the Sudan, entire villages were affected as young men were captured and subjected to this brutal practice. Many eunuchs who served in the harem of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul remained in servitude for life, isolated from their African roots. Their roles as loyal servants or guards sometimes meant they were isolated from their own cultural backgrounds and communities for life. Young boys were captured and castrated so that when they grew up, they could serve as eunuchs in harems. This slave ship was photographed in 1896. This large group of young boys may have been destined for castration to serve as eunuchs. The slaves in the photograph were headed to a Muslim country well after the American Civil War. In fact, slavery in the United States was a good bit more humane than slavery in the Arab world. It was bloody for Africans, bloody beyond words. In some cases, African societies would engage in castration as a preemptive measure to protect their youth from being captured and castrated by Arab slave traders. This reflects the deep fear and trauma associated with this practice. 4. Psychological and physical trauma. Castration was itself a traumatic experience, both physically and psychologically, for those subjected to it. The surgery itself was often performed without anesthesia under crude and unhygienic conditions, leading to excruciating pain and a high risk of infection. Many African boys did not survive their castration surgery. 6 out of every 10 people who were mutilated died from their wounds in castration centers. This is a prime reason why there are not many communities of blacks living in the non-African Muslim world today, despite the millions of black African slaves who were sold into the Muslim world. Castration led to hormonal imbalances on survivors, affecting the physical development and health of victims. Without testosterone, eunuchs often suffered from various health issues such as decreased muscle mass, fatigue, obesity, osteoporosis, and a lack of secondary sexual characteristics. 5. Cultural and religious beliefs. Some societies believed that castrated individuals were spiritually purer and more suitable for certain religious duties. For instance, in some Islamic societies, eunuchs were considered more appropriate for guarding holy sites. The guardianship of the Holy Kaaba in Mecca included the use of African eunuchs. Some men were castrated to be eunuchs in domestic service, and the practice of neutering male slaves was not limited to only black males. The Khalifa in Baghdad at the beginning of the 10th century had 7,000 black eunuchs and 4,000 white eunuchs in his palace, writes author Ronald Siegel in his 2002 book Islam's Black Slaves, The Other Black Diaspora. In the Arab world, demand for castrated slaves was so high that even with the appalling death rate from the procedure, it was still profitable, which explains why there is no large African diaspora community in Arab countries. Castrated men don't father children. The Arab slave trade had a tragic impact on the evolution of African societies. Some areas were completely devastated and depopulated. Welsh explorer Henry Morton Stanley, from 1841 to 1904, was a horrified witness of this traffic. He wrote that after the depredations of the Arab traffickers, the black blood flows toward the north, the equator smells corpses. As one commentator puts it, could it be true that the corrosive effects of 4 centuries of commerce in humans, with its temptation, its inbuilt opportunism, its reduction of humans to a cash value, its cycles of revenge, and its inevitable physical brutality, have built lasting flaws into the African pattern of thought and action? The United Nations has made March 23 the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, and UNESCO has made August 23 the International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition. When will there be an international day to commemorate the victims of the Arab-Muslim slave trade? When will an international research program address this subject? When will a project be implemented to identify, restore, and publicize the sites and monuments linked to this Arab trade, like the existing projects concerning the transatlantic trade? When will educational material be produced and cultural and artistic programs conducted to raise awareness of this criminal activity? When will a museum on the Arab-Muslim slave trade be established? This brings us to the end of this video segment. And did you happen to learn a thing or two? If so, then don't forget to like the video, share with your families and friends, and subscribe to keep the channel growing. Thank you for watching.
In order to make Islam appear attractive to black people, some Muslims say that the Prophet Muhammad was black. Even Allah was claimed to be black as well.
What? Allah is also black?
Let's hear what a Muslim said to Malcolm X in this movie.
I tried to act
I'm
like...
telling you God's words, not no hustle. And I'm gonna tell you, God is black.
God is black.
Allah is black, Prophet Muhammad is black, Islam is the religion of the Africans. Islam abolished slavery, freed slaves, elevates women, eliminates discrimination.
But actually, there is no evidence of that statement. As a matter of facts, based on Islamic literatures, Prophet Muhammad enslaved people, owned and sold slaves, including several black slaves.
It's a pleasure doing business with you, O Rasulullah.
He was neither black nor African. The Islamic traditions emphasize how white his skin was. Sahih Bukhari 1, number 367. He uncovered his thigh and I saw the whiteness of the thigh of the Prophet. Sunan Abu Dawud, volume 20, number 3200. I still seem to see the whiteness of the forearms of the Apostle of Allah. Sahih Bukhari, volume 2, book 17, hadith number 122. And a white person, Muhammad, who is requested to pray for rain. Muhammad was not a white Caucasian, but an Arab man with a relatively fair complexion than most Arabs around him. The repeated statements regarding the whiteness of the Prophet Muhammad's skin are directly related to the meaning of the colors of black and white in Islam. Quran, Surah Ali Imran, verse 106. The day when faces are whitened, and faces blackened. Then, as for the ones whose faces are blackened, did you disbelieve after your belief? Then taste the torment for that you disbelieved. Quran, Surah Az-Zumar, verse 60. And on the day of resurrection thou, Muhammad, sees those who lied concerning Allah with their faces blackened. is not the home of the scorners in hell. According to these verses, people whose faces are whitened will go to heaven, while the ones that were blackened will go to hell. If Allah decides some black men go to heaven, then their black faces would be whitened as if there is something wrong with having black skin. Allah wants to be sure that no black face ever show up in heaven.
Oh, it's not like that, bro. Those verses are metaphorical without any racist connotations.
However, there are some hadiths that link black skin and creation with Judgment Day. Mishkat al-Masabi, Volume 1, Chapter 4, Part 2, page 36. Abu Darda. The Prophet of God said, God created Adam and struck him on the right shoulder, and brought out his white children. You would say they were pearls. Then he struck his left shoulder, and produced his black children. You would say they were coals. And God said those of the right side are towards paradise, and I have no fear. And he said of those of the left side, they are towards hell and I fear not. What does it mean when Allah said I fear not? This is what he means. The expression here twice repeated, in the original La Abali, implies, I have no fear that their future deeds will falsify the sentence which I have now pronounced, seeing I have already predestined all their action. Abdul Haq. So, according to this hadith, Allah already decided all black people he created would go to hell no matter what they did, since he already predestined their fates. This hadith explains very clearly that in Islam, Allah made the destiny of human beings before he created them. He already decided to bless the extremely white-skinned people to heaven and to curse the extremely black-skinned people to hell. It's clear that Allah judges them based on the color of their skin and that for Allah, white is pure, holy, clean, while black is the opposite of it. In fact, other narrations even command that any person claiming that Muhammad was black be put to death. Muhammad Messenger of Allah. Ash-Shifa of Qadi Iyad, page 375. Ahmad ibn Abi Sulayman, the companion of Sanan, said, anyone who says that the Prophet was black should be killed. The Nation of Islam teaches that white people are devils. Their members might want to ponder this statement by Muhammad. The Apostle said,
whoever wants to see Satan, let him take a look at Nabtul bin al-Harith.
He was a sturdy black man with long flowing hair, inflamed eyes, and dark ruddy cheeks. He used to come and talk to the apostle and listen to him and then carry what he had said to the hypocrites.
But you have to see the whole context. Nabtal is a hypocrite. That's why the Prophet called him Satan.
There were many hypocrites surrounded the Prophet, but he only called Nabtal, who was black, as Satan. How about calling a black woman as an epidemic? Sahih Bukhari, Volume 9, Book 87, Hadith 161.
I saw in a dream a black woman with unkempt hair going out of Medina and settling at Mahaya, namely Al-Juffa. I interpreted that as a symbol of epidemic of Medina being transferred to that place, Al-Juffa.
Ah, come on. That was just a bad dream. No big deal, okay?
Sahih Muslim, Book 10, number 3901. During the time of migration to Medina.
Ya Rasulullah, I want to pledge allegiance with you.
Oh, sure. I'd be more than happy to accept your pledge.
Thank you, Rasulullah. I will migrate with you.
That guy is my slave. I want to have him back, or you can buy him from me.
I didn't know that he is a slave. Okay, I will buy your slave with mine. Here, take my slave.
Huh? He is a black slave, while mine is an Arab slave.
Oh, alright then. Here, have another one. I lost my property because of that guy. That was several thousand dinars gone.
Rasulullah, there is another guy want to pledge allegiance with you.
Is he a slave or a free man? I don't want to lose more property.
Apparently, at that time, the price of one Arab slave is equal with 2 black slaves. Prophet Muhammad saw his black slaves as his currency. Here is another hadith about Prophet Muhammad's black slave. Malik's Muwatta, Book 21, number 21.13.25. During the year of the attack of Khaybar, Prophet Muhammad got a new black slave named Medam. When Medam was unsaddling the camel of the Prophet, a stray arrow struck and killed him. People came and said, "Oh, he died as a martyr. He must be in heaven now." But the Prophet said,
"No, by he in whose hand myself is. The cloak which he took from the spoils on the day of Khaybar before they were distributed will blaze with fire on him."
Just to clarify, Muhammad had sex with a 9-year-old girl, robbed caravans, and beheaded hundreds of Jews, but he's good. His black slave, by contrast, grabbed a cloak before the spoils were divided, so he's headed to hell. Welcome to Islam. Mindlessly obeying Muslim leaders was so important to Muhammad that when he wanted to emphasize obedience, he told his followers that they had to obey even the worst leader imaginable. We find Muhammad's worst-case scenario in Sahih al-Bukhari 7142.
You should listen to and obey your ruler, even if he was an Ethiopian black slave whose head looks like a raisin.
So, the worst possible leader of a community of Muslims, according to Muhammad, would be a black slave.
Look, you're not being honest and fair here. One of the best Sahaba was Bilal, and he was a black guy, who was freed by Abu Bakr. We uphold and love Bilal because of his dedication to Islam.
Bilal was a slave before he converted to Islam and continued to be a slave after that. Sahih Bukhari, Volume 5, Book 87, Hadith 99. Narrated case, Bilal said to Abu Bakr,
"If you have bought me for yourself, then keep me for yourself, but if you have bought me for Allah's sake, then leave me for Allah's work."
The hadith explains that, after Prophet Muhammad died, Bilal asked Abu Bakr to set him free. He wouldn't ask Abu Bakr such a request if he was not a slave anymore.
Bilal is a good slave, and a great blessing from Allah. I don't think Allah wants me to lose his blessing.
Which one is the prophet? This white guy. What does Satan look like? That black guy. Now how did a religion that was inaugurated by a white prophet who had black slaves and referred to Ethiopians as raisin heads, and said that Satan looks like a black man ever get the reputation it has among African American Muslims today? Well, in the West, there's a general atmosphere of ignorance about Islam. People don't know even the most basic facts about Muhammad and the Quran. And this allows Muslim preachers to say whatever they want about Islam, because no one's going to correct them. So if a Muslim preacher is talking to a woman who's interested in women's rights,
Muhammad was a champion of women's rights.
If he's talking to someone who has a high regard for science,
the Quran is a scientific masterpiece, filled with miraculous scientific insights that were only verified centuries later.
If he's talking to someone who's concerned about racial justice,
Islam is the religion that liberates slaves and establishes racial equality.
Absolute nonsense. But people convert to Islam because they believe what they're told and don't bother reading the Muslim sources to see if the preacher's story checks out.